I think I just saw her walking down the hallway, so I think she'll be in here shortly. I know at least one commissioner has to leave at 6:55. So why don't we get started? This is just a meeting regarding the future of John Walton Spencer School number 16. And Dr. Vargas, I appreciate you taking the time this evening and your team describing what you believe to be the condition and future of that school. So I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, and we appreciate the opportunity to present to you. It's a very important topic, and the board have been interested and concerned about returning 16 to its built, to the original location. And tonight you will receive a presentation that I think will answer many of the questions that you have. And with me, I have three able people that are going to do that. So I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce himself. And we are going to have, Steve is going to lead the presentation.
Go ahead. Good evening. Mike Schmann, the Chief Operating Officer with the district.
Hi, I'm Tom Renato. I'm the Executive Director with the Joint School Construction Board.
And I'm Steve Rebholz with SWBR Architects. Also with me is Allison Shannon from SWBR. Together with our team, we worked on this report. And unless there's any other words of introduction, I can jump right in.
Yep. The only thing I want to say, President White and Commissioner and Vice President Elliott, this is fulfilling your request. You requested this, and we are responding to the request. And this is a complicated issue and do take a lot of time and a lot of work. So what you're going to see is evidence of that work, that we have thoroughly examined your concerns so that we can have a solid response.
I just want some clarification question. Now, are we, the school 16 is in the new renovation, the renovation modernization plan, correct? So we are going to do the renovations. And so what impact does that have on our budget for our schools? And are there some schools that we've had to pull back on some improvements on, or how does this?
Now that's a great question by President Elliott, and I think throughout the presentation your question will be answered. Okay. The answer is yes, it is on phase 2, but you will get even a better response as Steve will discuss in the next few minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I understand you all received the study. The slideshow in front of you and the slideshow on the screens is kind of an overview of that study, but if you have any detailed questions about the study, we're prepared to answer those as well. But before we get into any detailed questions, I just want to kind of go over the overview. The agenda tonight, we're going to review the purpose of the study, why we were asked to do what we did. Building and site infrastructure, as you know, the modernization program is very focused on the infrastructure needs, condition needs of the building. The educational program and space requirements, it's very important that the building, when it's redeployed, has appropriate space for the program. As part of the report, we developed 3 options. We'll give you the overview of those options, the cost estimates for those options. We'll talk about building aid considerations, the maximum cost allowance, which of course is very important in our planning, and a phasing approach and timeline. All of these things are in the report, and on the agenda page here, you'll see where in the report they're located, so that when you want more detail, that's where to go in the report. The purpose of the study, we were retained by the Rochester Joint Schools Construction Board to evaluate the feasibility of reoccupying John Walton Spencer School building at 321 Post Avenue as a pre-kindergarten through 6th grade school. As such, as I said, we looked at building and site infrastructure modernization, program fit, estimated cost, SCD building aid, and an implementation strategy, all of that outlined in the report. A little bit of history. The original portion of the building was constructed in 1910, additions in 1912-15, 1917-1920, so a majority of this building is actually was built between 1910 and 1920. There were also additions in the 70s, in the 80s, late 80s, 95, and 2000. Two of those additions were not actually additions at all. They were modular classroom structures. So 4 of the classrooms at this site are in modular structures. That brings us to the site today. When you look at kind of a 3-dimensional view of the building, you'll see that if you were to build it today, you wouldn't quite do it like this. So it was really a reactionary series of additions that happened over time. The first floor is quite large, you might say sprawling. The third floor is quite small, so administratively you've got challenges in administering a 3-story building with a small upper floor. Within the 3 stories, there's 7 distinct floor levels, so they jump up and down. If you've been in the building, you know that you're walking up half a flight or down half a flight to get from one part of the first floor or one part of the second floor to another. The building infrastructure, as I said, was a focus of the report, and at the end of the report, you'll see very detailed description of the various systems. But many of those building systems and components have reached the end of their useful life, as you would imagine, with the building that was where a majority of it was constructed prior to 1920. One thing that you've probably heard before is the deteriorating floor systems. Tom Casa and his team were able to resurrect some photographs of some work that was done not that long ago, and you'll see in it there's actually brick pavers on dirt that make up the floor system in significant portions of this building. So it's an interesting, archaic, not a system that you would use today, and certainly not a system that's going to last well into the future as you would need with a modernization. So in tackling the systems, we're also tackling structural components like this. We mentioned the modular classroom structures. One of the goals of the modernization program is to eliminate those and create attached space or redistribute space such that you don't need those structures anymore. The kitchen servery is really just a warming kitchen. It doesn't have the full kitchen component that is the current plan for buildings of this type. The gymnasium is actually a multi-purpose room. It's a nicely scaled space, but it has this balcony in it. It's really more appropriate for use as an assembly space than a gymnasium. So that was one of the challenges as it's been grown and grown and grown as a school. That same multi-purpose room has served both as multi-purpose and gymnasium, and there's a balcony that is only about 9 feet. You'll see in the photo, only about 9 feet above the floor. So the kinds of activities that you have in a PE program are challenged by that balcony. I mentioned the detached modular classroom structures, so classes have to move back and forth across the site, or classes have to be put out there that don't have any connection with the school, which is a shame in a school. The site itself is almost 4 acres. It's bounded in a nicely stable and developed neighborhood with a little bit of frontage along Post Avenue. But there's some issues with that. If it were a school building we were building today, we'd be looking for an 8 or 9 acre site for a building of this population. Site expansion here is impractical because of the nice neighborhood around it and the institutional facility to the north. There is no off-street bus loop or drop-off. There is an on-site parking deficiency, so we need to further take up limited site space to make sure that we tackle that deficiency. An expansion of the building footprint, making the building larger, is impractical because you're just taking up more and more of that precious green space. So this diagram here, the red line illustrates in scale what an 8 acre site would look like in this location. So it's easy enough to think it's double, but you can kind of get a sense of the impracticality of expanding that site. Certainly removing the modular classrooms will improve that, allow us to expand the parking, which is nice, but there's still limited outdoor area. So if we were to build an addition, for example, a gymnasium addition, that would take up pretty much all of that area. And there's still limited area for any off-street drop-off. So the bus loading and unloading and any vehicle parent drop-off is still going to happen on the street. We really can't bring that onto the site in its current location. So that kind of gives you a sense of the building infrastructure that we need to address, the site infrastructure we need to address. Again, in the back of the report, we get into more detail about those systems and the scope of work and cost for replacing those systems. So we moved to the program, and we were asked to evaluate this as a pre-K through 6th grade rather than pre-K through 8th grade. You'll recall one of the challenges was when 7th and 8th grade came into this site, the gymnasium, the various spaces that were built as elementary spaces really didn't work that well for 7th and 8th grade. So if we're going to come back, we either have to create those 7th and 8th grade spaces or we have to reconfigure to a pre-K through 6th grade. The charge that we received was to look at this as a pre-K through 6th grade. So we did that, and the basic building size would want to align itself as a 3 classrooms per grade level configuration. We call it a 3-strand configuration in this report. So you'll see that there's 3 classrooms for every grade level, including pre-K, assuming that the full day pre-K initiatives would continue to expand and become part of this program. We also want to make sure that there's appropriate space for all of the incidental and ancillary uses around a program of this scale. And in the report, we give a full, complete listing of all of the spaces, not just the classroom spaces. One of the things we learned was once we eliminated the modular classrooms and started to accommodate all of those spaces that really should be in a school of this size and configuration, there's not enough classrooms in the remaining building for a full 3-strand configuration. So we developed a modified program. I call it modified 3-2-strand. We could probably call it program B a little better. But it provides 3 classrooms per grade level at the kindergarten through 3rd grade. It provides a little bit of extra flex space in case there's a bubble of enrollment as it moves through the building. But then it drops down to 2 classrooms per grade level at grades 4 through 6. You can imagine the challenges of that as you establish a school community, and then perhaps organically kids move around the transient nature of life. But you can't count on that. So if you've got 3 classrooms in 3rd grade, you would want to have 3 classrooms in 4th grade. So the modified 3-2-strand is not something we're recommending. It's simply something that we're reporting out that that's what fits. So you could look at it as a 2-strand building. The modified 3-2-strand.
Fits in the current
Fits in the
space?
current space without any additions.
Okay.
Right? So you'll see in the report 3 options. One option is no addition, and then another option is with an addition so that we can accommodate the full 3-strand program. There's also some things you can do to drill into this, and certainly we would need to work closely with instructional leadership to determine how we might make that work. But for the purpose of the study, we have an option that has no addition, so it requires a modified program. And exactly what that program would be would need good, serious dialogue with instructional leadership. And then we have options with a full 3-strand program. So we wanted to make sure that everyone understood the implications of all of that. Okay, so option 1, as I mentioned, there's no addition at all. It's that modified 3-2-strand program that I mentioned to you, starting with more grades at the younger grade levels and then reducing the number of classrooms at the older grade levels. It does remove the modular structures so that we can provide the site amenities that are needed for sufficient parking. As I mentioned, there's no addition, but we would modernize that entire building. All of those systems that are at the end of their useful life would be modified, would be addressed, reconstructed, rebuilt as part of option 1. This option 1 would keep the warming kitchen that's there now. It would not be able to provide the full kitchen option. This option would not provide full building air conditioning. So that was one option for consideration that we placed down. It's kind of fix the building up, modernize it, address all the stuff that's there, but don't do the add-ons of the kitchen and the air conditioning or the additional classrooms. So that's option 1. Option 2 is that same modified 3-2-strand program, but it provides the kitchen, which will need to be in an addition because there's not sufficient space in the building for the scale of kitchen to provide the healthy food service programs that are desired. And it provides full building air conditioning, which is an important initiative that the district would like evaluated. So we were looking at the costs of doing that. Option 3 provides the classroom addition for the full 3-strand program. Again, we do everything in option 1 in terms of removing the modular classrooms, modernizing the existing building, We take care of the kitchen by putting a full kitchen program in there. And this isn't a full cooking kitchen, but it's the elementary kitchen program that you might have seen in some of the modernized K-8 buildings. And full building air conditioning. But in order to accommodate that full three-strand program, we need an addition. So where would we put an addition? Because you heard me earlier say there's no room for an addition. We are actually looking at restructuring the one-story wing of the building along the south to put a second story on top of it. So there's a little complexity there, but it solves a few needs by, remember that diagram that had the very large first floor? If we were to add onto the first floor, that makes the first floor even larger. So we're looking at, a little bit of structural complexity that we think would provide a better layout, a better circulation in order to do that. And it would preserve the site area, which in this site is very needed. So that's option 3. The estimated cost, and these are estimated project costs, so they include all construction and incidental costs, furnishings, equipment, contingencies, program costs. It's an all-inclusive cost. I should mention it does not include capitalized interest, which is one of those financing things that comes later on in the program, but it's kind of the project.
So none of these costs includes capitalized interest?
Capitalized, that's correct.
Okay.
That has to kind of be looked at program-wide. And I don't know what they are. But so when it comes time to look at the entire program, there'll be the capitalized interest added on to all of these things. So the estimated cost for one is about $20.6 million. For option 2, $23.5 million. Option 3, just under $29 million. So you can see how each option grows in terms of its cost. Very important, in addition to looking at cost, is to look at the maximum cost allowance. That is the formula that the state currently has for identifying how much of the capital project cost would be eligible for building aid. You'll recall that you get a significant building aid reimbursement up to that maximum cost allowance, and anything over the maximum cost allowance is local share.
Let me just get,
Sure.
if I could, a clarification on that. He's talking about building aid, but I thought that the modernization funding is what we're going to use for this, and it would seem to me that billable aid would not apply to this.
Would you like to
So
respond?
you should think of the modernization funding as a source of funds. It's the checkbook that the costs for the project are going to be written out of. The reimbursement side of this, the total project needs to work by optimizing the building aid that comes back to the district. So although you have the source of funds, okay, in order to make this work in terms of the local share, you need to optimize the building aid that comes back to the district. Tom, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that?
I got it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So the maximum cost allowance in the building aid is a critical component. Even though you have the authorization to spend the money, the whole financial plan depends on the reimbursement coming back to the district.
That is a great question, by the way, on something.
I think I must have
No, but
thought about that, so.
I think it's always, we constantly need to remind ourselves about the technicality, and Michael and other in here could answer any question, but it's a great question.
Thanks. So option 1, the maximum cost allowances currently, and these are kind of current numbers, so maximum cost allowance changes every month. Current as of the month the report was written, just under 11 million, leaving a shortfall, and the total percent of the maximum cost allowance versus estimated cost was, in this case, 53%. You'll recall that we want to be much closer to 95% in these types of things. Option 2, estimated cost is higher, the maximum cost allowance is the same. Recall that we added a kitchen and air conditioning. Neither of those things drive building aid. It's just a crazy aspect of the formula. And so you add a kitchen, you add air conditioning, you get no additional building aid. So that kind of drives the difference up. You have a larger shortfall, and your percentage eligible is that much less. Option 3, once we build an addition, that addition contains classrooms. Those classrooms do drive some building aid, although not a whole lot, but they get it up closer to 11.7 million in building aid. But the cost of that addition, of course, is higher than the age you get, and that drives that, that shortfall up and the percentage down. So these are very discouraging numbers that we're faced with the current funding or the current aid scenario. So I wanted to take this opportunity to jump into some of these building aid considerations.
The reason, Vice President Elliams, that I think your question is so important that we need to remind ourselves, I stated to you early on that this project is affordable. We causing any harm to other operation of the district, like instruction, textbooks, everything else that goes along with sustaining a program. If we get 98% reimbursed, now I do believe that we could live, let's say, up to 95 and still be okay. If this will not be sustainable, if every project you will have to come up with about 40%. And in this case, in auction 3, it will be 60% of the cost. At approximately, if you were to go with auction 3, I'm not saying that you're going with it, that means that you have to come up with at least more than $15 million just to pay for this, versus if you were to get 98% reimbursed.
So if I can ask this question, why is the MCA so low?
Go ahead, Mike.
Sure.
Michael or Steve, either one.
Yeah, the maximum cost allowance, MCA, is a formula that's driven by the use of the space. Elementary schools have lower cost factors than secondary buildings, high schools, and the size of the building times the formula drives this number. The number really doesn't support the kind of money you would need to build a new building. It's very typical that a maximum cost allowance will only cover about this much, 40, 50%, if you're building a new building. In this case, the building's quite old, so there's actually a lot of surprises we're anticipating. There's a lot of work that we've identified. The costs of doing this renovation are starting to inch up to that level of a new building. Not quite, but close. And certainly one of the reasons why in earlier studies this was a facility that was looked at for replacement, replacing the school in this location with a new building. You'll recall that was something that was part of the 2007 study, anyone that was around back during that study. And I think that was still a sound recommendation given the condition of the facility. Fast forward to 2015, state ed is not encouraging, and I would say discouraging, any thought of a new building for this district. And so we need to look at how we would implement the project. So you'll recall at the beginning I talked about phased implementation, and I'm just going to get to that if that's okay, if you let me kind of get through that, and then we can talk about a phased implementation versus asking for special consideration, which is something that's happening now as well. So you saw that the maximum cost allowance is less than the estimated cost, and it's less than by a lot. The current regulation is that the maximum cost allowance has this 5-year period. If you spend it all in 1 year, you've got to wait 5 years, and then you'll have it to spend again. That's just the regulation that they've put in place. If you're spending a fifth a year, that works fine. You're spending a fifth every year, 5 years later, the first year drops off, and everything's hunky-dory. So if you've got $10 million maximum cost allowance and you spend $2 million a year, you're going to be able to chug along and maintain a fully eligible for aid situation. That's what many districts do. Many suburban districts are constantly doing projects, not enormous projects, but small projects that are well within the maximum cost allowance and almost fully supported, eligible for the building aid. So we've got that 5-year time frame to discuss. And so that brings us to a phased approach or special consideration. So a little bit of history. Past capital investment in this district has been dampened by the fact this is a fiscally dependent district with a debt limit. And so district-wide, your capital investment has always been much smaller than your capital need. That's kind of how many of the facilities got to this point. Not for lack of wanting or needing or doing a great job, because I want to underscore that the capital work that's been done here has been very good. And indeed, if any one of you calls State Ed and asks them, they'll tell you the very same question, that of the Big Five, Rochester is taking the best care of their facilities. I know it doesn't always seem that way, but that's true from their perspective, and you're doing a good job focusing, targeting those investments, and getting things done. But even with that, at the school Building 16, over the last 28 years, your facilities department has tracked all of the projects that happened over the last 28 years. It adds up to $6.2 million. Well, we know we've got a $20 to $29 million need today. 28 years of $6.2 million. There's been a lot of MCA left on the table, right? But for that debt limit, you would have done $2, $3 million projects every 3 years in your 3-year cycle. The windows would be replaced, the roofs would be up to snuff, the heating system would have been replaced already. All of these things would have been done, and you'd be addressing the program needs. Well, now we've got all of those infrastructure needs, plus the program needs, and all of those infrastructure needs that have kind of built up over time because of the debt limit constraints that this district's been under. This is, you know this, this is district-wide. In the older buildings, certainly your new buildings are in much better shape. That $6.2 million, if you look at it on a square foot basis, you might say that's not much, but if you look at your overall physical plant, School 16 is actually in the top half of dollars per square foot invested. This is prior to the FMP, okay? So now the FMP comes along, you're able to get these big shots in the arm. But for 28 years, you've been doing great stuff with very, very limited budgets. And this is kind of what's happening, and it's happening here. You're going to see it at many of your older buildings, School 1, School 23. I'm sure if I had all of them in my head, which I should, there's a dozen buildings that are going to be in a very similar situation because of their older wood buildings, pre-1920s, and they're going to have similar needs. So that's why RCSD staff are requesting special consideration, because we've done a good job, and SED acknowledges that. You've done a good job. I shouldn't say we. You've done a good job. SED acknowledges that. So what would be that special consideration? We just don't know yet. There's got to be a coordinated effort, a coordinated ask to really get that maximum cost allowance large enough, because the phased approach, which I should have talked about first, would say, all right, we've got $20 million worth of work. We've got $11 million maximum cost allowance, so we break it into 2 phases. And that's kind of what's currently articulated in the previous master plan, the previous phase 2 master plan. You do half now, move everyone out, do half now. 5 years later, move everyone out again, do the second half. Kind of a crazy way to do implementation, but that's that 5-year setback, reset on the building aid. So that takes you for option 1, from that 53% up to 95%. So you can have the 95%, but you're going to need to do it in 2 phases, and those 2 phases are going to need to be 5 years apart. So that's a part of the strategy of the ask. Isn't that crazy? Can't we do this in some other way? Option 2 in 2 phases would be about 90% eligible for aid. Option 3 would, whoops, where'd it go here? Did I miss it? Option 3 would be 3 phases in order to get up to that 95%. 3 phases, 5 years apart is 12, 13 years. So imagine the disruption and the patience that will be needed in order to fully implement the plan. Certainly you'd be back in the building in 5 years, but half of it would be done, half of it would not be done. And you wouldn't have the addition, so you'd be working in that modified 3-2-strand program or some other configuration, maybe with no pre-K, maybe with no 6th grade, something like that.
But we're also not talking about the same students returning for the most part either,
Right.
if it was done in multiple phases.
That would be, depending on how the swing space works, I mean, each phase would be,
But most of them would be.
the students would move out for 1 school year. So you'd move out for a school year and move back. Easier said than done. You all know the disruption that causes to instruction.
You know what, I think I made a mistake. I'm thinking that you talked about that the students would not return for like 5 years.
No.
Okay,
They would only be gone during the
okay.
time that the construction happens. But the construction can't be done over 1 summer. The construction's going to need to start before or at the end of 1 school year in June, go through the next year, and be completed by September of the following year. So there's about a 15, 16-month cycle of
Okay.
construction that's needed to do this kind of a project. You can't do it around the students. So each time you do that, project one, phase one, or phase two, phase two, you would have the students, well, in this case, the students are already in swing space. So you would start phase two, finish it, they would move back. But then 5 years later, you would move them out again, start the next phase, then move them back. And if you were looking at if you were looking to optimize building aid, and you were looking at option 3, you would need 3 phases. You would move them out again in 10 years. So,
I was going to say, we
Go ahead.
believe that, without getting too far into a strategic conversation, but we certainly believe that from an instructional program perspective, from certainly an effective use of resources, and then to be able to complete as much work as possible within a consolidated window of time, that by trying to do a little bit more strategic approach, we're able to hopefully accomplish much more, because 16 is a very unique building, a very unique school community, but it's not unique to the other challenge that we're facing. We'll have several buildings that will face a very similar type of scenario in terms of the moving out, moving back in, and only being able to do a limited scope of work within a block of time, whether it be a 12-month time period or whatever, or whatnot. And you'd have students returning back to a facility that would be, somewhat only half completed, in the sense that it'll be ready to move in instructionally, but not an optimum instructional space like we would all envision that to be. So we're really hoping that this a larger strategic conversation that Steve's alluding to would not only be a much more sufficient way of maximizing resources for our situation at School 16, but also would be able to involve other buildings into that conversation, and be much more of a long-term strategy for us so we also are making maximum use of our swing space options for students.
the time frame and disruption resulting from the phased approach is very undesirable. I mean, that's putting it in a nice way. It stinks, right? It really does. But if we were able to do it in one single phase, we still need to go through the process, and the process is significant, starting with, if you started today, between today and the time you could get plans into SED for building permit, you're looking at between 15 to 18 months. You've got the SED review and approval process, bidding and award, construction, the total duration here being about 3 to 4 years. So even best case single phase, we'd be looking at a fall 2018 reoccupancy if someone were to pull the trigger today and we were to run like crazy to get this thing done in 3 years, 3.5. If it was 2 phases, it's going to be 6 to 7 years, 3 phases, 11 to 12 years. And again, each time that construction phase came, that 18 months came, and the scale of the construction depends on what you're doing. So if it were phased, that construction period would probably be 12 to 15 months instead of 18 months. But in any case, the kids would have to move out, the whole school would have to move out and move back.
One other sorry to interrupt,
Sure.
but the estimated cost for moving a school is about $150,000 to $200,000, depending on the number of students. That's a non-aidable expense. So when you do the math on moving students 3 times, you're almost into $500,000 just in the moving costs alone. And that's a pretty standard operating number for us to work from. So we're also obviously trying to eliminate that really inefficient use of resources as best as we possibly can.
So this is the summary slide, and again, we'll be available for questions as long as you want. But please understand the modernization of School Building 16 will require replacement and renovation of significant building components and systems. These are systems that are simply at the end of their useful life and need to be replaced in order to modernize the facility. Housing the full 3-strand program will require an addition, so that has to be very carefully done with respect to this site. The estimated cost exceeds the maximum cost allowance, and the strategy for attacking that is either a phased approach or special consideration. The time frame and disruption and cost, as Mike said, of the phased approach is very undesirable, and that's why the ask is going to SED Facilities Planning for some way to make these things logically implementable and supportable. Rochester needs this now, not 10 years from now. So with that, I'll conclude this part of the presentation. If you had any specific questions about the detail of the report or anything you heard tonight, we're here to help.
I want to apologize first if the discussion goes. I'm the one that has to leave at 6:55,
Oh,
so if I get up and
sure.
leave, I apologize.
No.
So with the, just trying to get a sense of the special consideration, and I know it's complex and people with experience will be determining, you know, the likelihood and planning that out. I'm just wondering, like with the air conditioning issue and the kitchen issue, the Franklin campus, I believe we did air conditioning and the auditorium, a lot of really fantastic things that may not have typically been aidable. Were those secured through special considerations with SED?
No, the Franklin campus is a building with a very high maximum cost allowance. It's a secondary building that's quite large, and off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure, but it might be 45 to 50 million. The cost that was invested in Franklin was far below that, so all of those costs fell under the maximum cost allowance. So even though air conditioning was part of that, when I meant that air conditioning doesn't, what it doesn't do is it doesn't drive building aid. But if it's done in a project where the total costs are below the maximum cost allowance, then it's aidable. Okay? So that's the key, is this formula, which really doesn't connect very well with reality, but it's the formula we have. So if you had a $10 million maximum cost allowance and you could complete the project for $9 million, you would be below the maximum cost allowance. Now, SED does look at certain things, and they'll make judgments as to whether they're eligible for aid or not, even if they are below the maximum cost allowance. Examples of this are replacement furniture. So if furniture exists today and you're replacing it, they don't want to give you building aid for that. If you build an addition and you're putting new furniture in their addition, then they would give you building aid for that. So there's these kind of nuances. With the scale of modernization we're looking at, SED has actually given the district what is a really good consideration by allowing to look at a substantial rehabilitation as if it were a new building, and then they make those expenses eligible for building aid. But you still need to fall below the maximum cost allowance.
Right.
So there's kind of multiple equations going. If you think back to whenever you had multiple variables, multiple equations, you've kind of got to have it to be below the maximum cost of allowance and eligible for building aid. Once you do that, it's good for building aid. So in the case of Franklin, it was below the maximum cost allowance.
So that actually brings me to, you know, from, at least from my thinking, the urgency to try to address the sort of contradictory situation we have here, where some of our best buildings are, and placement of them geographically is mismatched with where our school age population and families and demand are. And, you know, we all have agreed that we prioritize strengthening neighborhood schools. So this is a contradiction. So I'm wondering, do you see a place for board advocacy in terms of trying to get elementary schools more appropriately aidable, given that situation? I mean, is that common throughout the state, where there's this big difference in aidability for secondary versus elementary schools? Yet, I mean, I think a lot of people are feeling, well, at least there's a significant side of arguments in favor of strengthening neighborhood schools, and many of them are old in many cities.
Sure. Well, all I can say is a coordinated approach with specific, strategic discussions would be appropriate. In this case, that started. We don't know where it's going to end. We hope it ends on the side of common sense and logic, because the need is there whether you do it in 2 phases or 1 phase. The funny thing about the formula and the current way the regulation is implemented is you could do this you could spend $10 million every 5 years for the rest of time. You're not looking to do that. You're looking to take care of this need now and not have to wait 10 or 15 years. But you could, if you wanted to, without much argument, because of the way the formula works, just keep spending and spending and spending money. You don't do that because you don't have the money, and you didn't have the debt limit before now to do that. So we hope that they are on the side of common sense. We don't know where they're ending up.
The only thing I was going to add is with Dr. Vargas's leadership, we at least started the conversation with the State Education Department from a big picture perspective. We're taking it a little bit larger than one particular building, because we have multiple buildings that kind of fall within the same MCA equation. So it's not so much about what their concern would be as about what we'd be putting in the necessary, but what would be part of the project, as much as the larger conversation about the MCA. So I think from an advocacy perspective, I believe it'd probably be a little bit premature for that conversation to take place. I think once we kind of garner our data, amongst the particular schools that kind of fall into the same financial equation that School 16 does, and we have that necessary conversation. It may just be that our math, so to speak, lines up with common sense, that lines up with the state education approval, and we can move forward relatively quickly. I think the level of advocacy would only come if we end up with, and I think we would defer to Dr. Vargas's leadership in terms of a bit of a roadblock anywhere along the way. But I would want to stress, all of our conversations up to now have been incredibly well received and very positive, because I think what Steve articulated earlier, we have not only a long track record of maximizing in our CIP projects on an annual basis, but also being able to show all that data on an annual basis in terms of our CIP process. So that, in addition with our strategic use of the FMP resources over the last several years, that actually makes our case very strong. So I'm not so sure it's multiple voices involved. It's just coordinating our efforts in terms of making sure all the data lines up, and then we can take it from there. But as I said, I don't want to make it too long-winded, but I think that's where we're
I
at.
just want to clarify, I wasn't talking about advocacy at the level of like district. I was talking about MCA rates in general, like statewide. Like I was thinking more like NISBA level, Big Five level, you know, like is there those rates being so discord between secondary, but it's not something, you know, it's just sort of a, thought experiment about.
Whenever we talk to them, they're hesitant to make changes that would allow the entire state to spend more and more money. These are very, this kind of a problem is not the problem that everyone has. It's a Big Five dependent district problem. It's not a problem in other areas. And because in other areas, if the community supports the investment is made, they borrow the money and they spend the money, and then 2 or 3 or 5 years later, they go back and do the same thing. Rochester doesn't have that luxury. They're fiscally dependent. They receive the allotment that they receive and spend it as best they can. So I'm not sure that would be well received. One thing I think is clear, though, is that they're going to want to see the plan, the comprehensive plan, because they're aware of the enrollment projections or aware of the enrollment trends in the districts. And if you were to go with an ask for one building without giving them the big picture, I suspect, and I know that they would ask for the big picture.
Yeah, now, I'm going to ask a question that may seem a bit ignorant, but I suppose I'm probably not the only person thinking this. The PowerPoint indicates that doing it the way that would optimize or give the most students opportunities to learn in this environment would be about $29 million, right?
Yep.
And that would take many, 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 many years, I think, as the PowerPoint said. How many years would?
Yeah, if phased, to optimize the maximum cost allowance, which doesn't reset for resets every 5 years.
2026.
It would be 2026.
Okay, now, here's the layperson's perspective, and that's my perspective. I was driving out in Henrietta today, and I saw, what's that, Costco's?
Yeah.
You know that building? They put that building up, Costco's. They put that building up in, what, 6 months, if that? And it's massive, absolutely massive. Now, again, I'm not an architect, right? And I've seen other buildings go up reasonably quickly. You made a quick reference to the fact the state does not want us to build new buildings. And in phase one, I remember there was some conversation about whether the legislation even would allow us to build a new building. Here's my point. If you're talking about 2026, to make this really work for the way you want it to work, I assume that if time were no factor and money were no factor, you would go with that third option, right? Because, right?
Well, this is the decision that needs to be made by the leadership of
But it just sounds,
district and the
objectively,
board,
it sounds like you get more
Yes.
students. I mean, it's the optimal format, is
Better-
what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's a better outcome.
Assuming that you could put up a new building, raise that building, and build a new one in probably a quarter of the time, if not even less than that, why can we, again, this may be an ignorant question, but why could we not just build a new building? Other than the state saying you can't,
Well,
you
the
shouldn't do
state,
it.
actually, they're not saying you can't do it. What they're saying is the formula is the formula, and if you choose to do it, you need to make that
What would a
investment.
new building cost?
I'm
29 million
predict
sounds
it
like
would
a
be
lot of
around
money
that-
to me. Like you could build a building for $29 million.
It would be around that $29 million. That's what I was saying earlier. The need in this
So-
building brings it to the point where it's starting to be close to the replacement cost
Sure.
of the building.
All right, so then I'm not that ignorant. So then
Not at all.
why wouldn't we, or why can't we just build a new building? Tear it down and
can,
build a new building?
But what the state will say is, if you choose to do that, the MCA is the MCA, so you would spend 29 million, the MCA would be 11.7 million, and you're more than welcome to do that, but you've got to find this money. Now, to build a new building in phases doesn't really work, right?
Right.
To do this kind of a project in phase could work. So you could do that first phase and move 600 kids into the building and have a 600 student pre-K through 6, although with this modified strand arrangement. Next phase comes back, you move the kids back. If it's a new building and you're going to spend 11 million, and that's kind of what happened at the beginning. They built the first piece, then they built the second piece, then they built the third piece. Imagine doing that 5 years apart. Your first piece would house 300 or 200 kids, right?
So if you're going to do the third option, if that was ever on the table, you would just build a new building. Because if the MCA is going to be that without regard to whether you, right?
That's what this district did in the 90s with 5 or 4 new buildings. That's
No.
what the
A new building is the
2007
same
plan
cost.
recommended. But the investment required is beyond the maximum cost allowance.
All right, so, again, indulge my ignorance, the maximum cost allowance. For the people who don't understand it, what is that?
It's a formula.
Okay.
right? That's, I mean, I wish it wasn't, but it is. So it's a formula that's driven based on the number of a certain type of space in the building
Yep.
and the size of that space in the building. For the purpose of elementary schools, the room type that creates building aid is a classroom. So for every classroom, they assign 27 building aid units. And then for each building aid unit, and that doesn't change, okay? It hasn't changed since the 70s. For each building aid unit, they give you X number of dollars. That changes monthly, but it's pegged to some historic cost factor that was created a long time ago. And the building aid units that you would get for a 600-student elementary school, the maximum cost allowance that would drive would be roughly 40% of the cost of a new building.
Now, who sets that? Architects aren't setting that maximum
No,
cost
that's
allowance.
the-
So somebody in Albany?
You know, I can't say, it's administered by
Or
the State
SED.
Education Department, Office of Facilities Planning, and Office of State Aid. That's who administers it. Who created the idea? Probably a legislature a long time ago.
Okay,
far
so,
away.
given the fact this is going to take 20-something years, if we want to do it the best way, wouldn't it be wise to take 26 months or 26 weeks to try to, not you, but us, to try to convince people? It sounds to me like this is very archaic, this maximum cost allowance that was set some time ago by somebody that nobody in here knows. Probably it doesn't even reflect what the reality of the situation is. Have we made any effort to try to get that adjusted? Because this seems absolutely silly that we would wait until 2026 to replace, to fix that building, rather than getting a new building in there, and we could build it within 26 months. See, that's, you know, again, and the reality of it is all around us. You can go into any community and see how quickly these buildings go up, and they're state-of-the-art. Instead, we're going to put this thing together with Band-Aids and whatnot. I know you're going to do a better job than that, but just it seems to me to be silly. And if the impediment here is this maximum cost allowance, which has been set by some wizard behind a curtain, we ought to be talking to that wizard. Maybe while you choose option 1 or 2, but it seems to me silly. We're not dealing with the problem here. This maximum cost allowance thing seems to be an impediment to doing this project the right way.
Well, as I said, the district staff have reached out, and they're asking for special consideration. I think the approach you would take, you're talking about, I don't know this, but I suspect it would take an act of the legislature, which may take a very, very long time. The 2026 date might be optimistic if you were to try to do that.
Oh, my goodness.
So I think the approach that's being taken is a sound approach. It seems to be positively received, and it's strategic, and it wants to work in a way that I think will bring common sense to bear. We just don't know what the answer is yet. So I think good outreach is happening at the right level, and Dr. Vargas and his team will be monitoring that, and then making sure that as the good news happens, you hear about it, and if roadblocks happen, we come up with a strategy to address them.
That's an excellent question and concern. And we are working very hard, and we believe that to for the legislature to do anything like this, they had to do a study of what are the millions of dollar implication or billions for the whole state. I think that we have a unique situation that lends itself to a reasonable request. And again, as Steve mentioned earlier, and a very, very important point that Steve made is the whole notion of that we are a fiscally dependent district. So never mind that we will have to go to city council and other places if we wanted to do any of these things, just to something for us to keep in mind. And I do think that this is a unique opportunity for Rochester, and that is that we had this FMP, Facility Modernization, source of funding that even allow us to have this kind of discussion. When I'm talking about for the entire system, I mean, another thing for the board to consider that this is not a project in isolation. What Mike did, which is the right thing to do, is that we are looking at all the buildings that might be in this situation so that we can even make a stronger case. Because as Steve was mentioning, that would be part of a comprehensive plan that has enrollment. And you have heard me say before that one of the things, if we were getting 10,000 refugees tomorrow, or students, or new students, we even have a more powerful case to do something more urgent. But remember, as a district, we have to be very measured, very careful, because we have a declining enrollment at the same time that we want to invest a significant amount of resources to modernize our buildings.
One other quick comment consistent with that. I have heard, I don't know if it's true, that 22 School, which is my alma mater, is sort of in the loop for phase 2. That may or may not be true.
Now, 22, actually, President White, as you might recall, revisit, and we can provide you the resolution in which the Board of Education adopted, and we will submit it to you, but, and that might bring some more clarity. I don't want to go beyond that because it's not the right place at the right time to get into what you order us to do via the resolution.
Well, the only reason why I mention that is 22 is a pretty, and again, I went to school there when I was a child, it's a pretty old building, and I know there's been conversations about whether it's even worth saving or renovating. Yeah. And I would make, and I think the argument was made a few years ago that we ought to just replace it and put a new building in there. And so my final question is consistent with that. The cost for the option 3 was about $29 million. And somebody said, it might have been you, that to replace it and build a new one would cost about $29 million. Is that true? Do you think that's right, or does anybody cost that out? Because let me just say, that $11 million difference may not be $11 million if the cost to replace it isn't. Is it $29 million?
So for the purpose of tonight's discussion, you could consider them comparable. We could cost it out as part of previous studies. We have done that. One thing to remember, if we were going to build a new building, the State Education Department would be looking for us to do that on an 8-acre site. So we need to find an 8-acre site to build that building. Would it be right here, or would it be nearby here, or would it need to be somewhere farther away, is an interesting question. Now, maybe they would give us a 6-acre site. Maybe they'd let us build it right here. Maybe they'd let us build a smaller building right here. So these are some of the things to think about. So, but for purposes tonight, let's say it's $29 million or $32 million for a new building. We haven't costed it out recently.
Would you think it's about that range?
I would love the chance to do that study for you. Yeah, I think it's about that range.
Because it's a significant question, because that $11 million difference that you say someone would have to pay for, it would be us, presumably. If it didn't cost $29 million, that $11 million figure would be different, would it not? Let's say hypothetically, $32 million, let's say hypothetically it cost $20 million, and this is probably not true. Right. It cost $20 million to build a building.
It wouldn't cost.
It wouldn't.
No way.
My goodness.
Yeah.
It cost $29 million to build the building.
Sure. These are, I mean, you know, or if you've taken time to look, these are real serious projects. Yes. Okay. That's the challenge. Goodness. That's the major challenge that districts are faced with.
Just in the piggyback on 22 School, I see some construction going on. Is that our construction, or is that the church that's doing some? There's some
Yeah, we don't have, yes.
Nothing going on? That's
Nothing
not
going
us?
on,
Okay.
other than just our normal maintenance.
Okay.
Work. Nothing, no projects currently going on.
Yeah, because I see cranes over in that area.
We
so
don't
I
need
could be
cranes there.
checked. Okay.
One thing,
And that building, just for your information, it's scheduled to be closed, and that was what I confirmed.
okay.
The building is scheduled to.
I don't know where I heard that. I heard that, and it was some news report that had 22, and I was a bit surprised.
It is in the resolution. It might be appropriate for us to, like I said, the appropriate time for us to give you an update of where we are, like building like 22 and all the building on 36.
So
That-
what I heard was probably not accurate. That's what surprised me. It said 22 was in the loop for Phase 2. And
But
that's-
that wasn't accurate.
That was not accurate.
That was
Okay.
not, at least basic in the
Right,
direction that
okay.
you gave us.
Okay, all right.
But
Thanks.
one
And
other thing-
again, any change that we make to what was submitted to the state, because part of the prerequisite to get any approval, that we had to submit a plan that Steve articulated, meaning, we all due respect, but they are not going to give us dollars for a space that we don't need. I mean, that's part of the criteria when they going to allocate funding. So if we are losing students, which we are, that means arguable common sense will tell us that we have less need for space. And even when our ability to advocate and do everything that we need to do diminish, if we have less need. But again, this is for another time that we can.
Well, I
sit
was
down.
going to, my question does relate to that in terms of the 16 school enrollment. So what's that enrollment? Are we at full capacity? Or, I guess the question also becomes, for me, is within that community, are there enough children in that community that the school can, that it could be supported?
And there are.
Or are we going to have to bus students in?
And again, that's a great question. The Enrollment Commission is 607 students, and 28%, actually 20% of the students are from that neighborhood.
Only 20%.
Correct, but and let me just say, and this is, I just wanted to leave it there, but if you look at School 2, and School 4, and School 19, and School 29, all that neighborhood are within a half a mile almost, or a mile, or School 16. Now, there are folks, and I believe me, I pay a big price because I made a mistake that when I say that Wilson Foundation was in the Nightingale Award, because Wilson always have been claimed. Now, you cross to the other side of the street, and I made that mistake that my ignorance, and that I said, well, Wilson Foundation has a capacity to accommodate a lot of students, and it's a wonderful facility, a beautiful building, world-class swimming pool, and it's, by the way, if you go to Chicago, anywhere in this country, they would be so jealous of us. And I want to thank Beverly Burrell Moore for her courage when she went in and she said, well, you can have students in a facility that cannot meet their basic need. And she brought it first to my attention, and I said, I spoke with the people in our facility, and there were plenty locations, including Wilson Foundation had a lot of space in there because they're on this growth down. So, and we had it at Freddie Thomas, which is a brand new facility. So when we make the decision, again, it was basic on need. It doesn't mean that we didn't want School 16, to continue.
I think the question would also be that when we invest in those targeted facilities, that you three parts. One, you're going to right-size your footprint, so to speak. Two, we're only going to invest in those facilities that are in areas where we really need to invest those in. And then the third piece is when we do the actual investment, we're going to build it to scale so we can meet the needs of the neighborhood that's there. So I think those are the three parts, which is why we had option 3 as one of the variables, because the build a building large enough to meet the needs of that neighborhood and that community would be one of the options we want to present you with.
So this has been more political decision more than it has been that there really is a need to have the school in the area. Because if you all are saying to me that only 20% of the students are from that area, I know that there were community representatives that came in and wanted
Right.
to make sure we kept
You're right,
that.
but there are, Vice President Elliott said, the nature of your question, remember that we have a school of choice, and we have citywide program. And the shift that I'm hearing from you and the community is that you would like us to shift the direction where it's possible to have more neighborhoods capability of position, and we are, for example, one of the things that this board did that you need to be congratulated is that you ended the sad reality that, for example, if Mike would come in and register his student as a kindergarten kid, let's say at school 16, he would have to re-register that kid and go into a lottery for kindergarten, and you help with the end that. And that is bringing a little bit more stability. Now, given the, and we have seen, by the way, I believe that we saw an increase on the pre-K kindergarten students, a significant movement to increasing the students that are living within the neighborhood as a result of that. And Patty, I think we can provide that information. So any shift that you make, it could move us again toward your desired goal to have more neighborhood students.
Well, let me just ask it a little differently. Do we have the census in that area in order to be able to support the school?
We do, and again, it will require us looking at the capacity of that area. Like I say, how do you define school 3, school 4, and school 2? Now, if you're from this community, you're right next to each other. So we strategically, there are those people reasonably can make an argument that you have plenty of seat around there that you can accommodate people from school number 16. Okay. Let me say that. Actually, that was a recommendation that we made in the phase 1. We recommended that we will close the school, retire building 16 and retire building 37 or 10, whichever you want to call it, and build a new facility in that area. And again, we wouldn't need a permission from the State Department to do so, to make sure that we capture, like Steve was saying, the maximum A. But we did recommend that, and you will find, Mike, we want to limit this conversation to number 16, but you will find that, and that's something that Steve before did an excellent job, and I want to thank him because he has been consistent, and it's good to have that consistent, and one of the things that we are finding through Building 58, and he was right, and all that were right, that that was going to cost, and we were going to find some problem in terms of additional costs, and we did, so they were right, thank you. We got our money worth in terms of the service, and I suspect that he's going to be right again in like Building 10 or Building 16 or Building 1, in which you are going to find some challenges. So again, let's keep it to school 16 because I think it was where you asked, but we are going to give you more information when Mike come up with his analysis about all the buildings that might find themselves in similar situations.
Well, let me just also put on the table as well. There's other data that says that the teen pregnancy rate has fallen dramatically. So when you have pregnancy rates that are dropping dramatically, you're not going to need as many schools. So I don't know how long that trend is going to continue. Okay. But, you know, over the last 10 years, those pregnancy rates have dropped considerably. And that will have an impact on schools, so, but I'm not exactly sure.
Thank you, and you mentioned the facts are the facts. The reality is that they are new school, and I have mentioned that the charter school are public school. For most people, when you don't pay for something, you have access and you have a process. Let's not debate it, but they have been new school that are in that neighborhood. And when you look at your demographic and when you are dealing with the State Department, you have to take that into account in terms of your population and everything else. And, you know, I do believe that the district will come around, hopefully fairly soon, in which we will begin to make the district more attractive so that people will have less need to go into charter school or private school. And let me just say that what you're doing with your art, music, extracurricular program, sport, and the curriculum, because at the end of the day, you need to deal with literacy and numeracy, the math and reading. Those are, every parent want their child to be able to read. And we as a district, and I'm telling the teachers, the principal, and our unions, that the future of this district depends on us improving our quality real fast. And that's what the board had asked us to do, and that's what we are doing. Hopefully we get there sooner rather than later.
When I was looking at the enrollment, I think down to grade 6, currently, the current year, it has 1 strand. So looking at those, the enrollment from that year, or from, I think it was 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, it does go down to 2 strands and then 1. Is that based on the transient nature of the population, or is it because simply that's the capacity?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask Beverly or Mark or you can answer. Thank you. Why don't you introduce yourself? I'm sorry I missed you. I couldn't see you there.
So the reason we had 1 grant is grade level. Last year we had 2 grade grants. They were all small grants. Just thought it was better to find out 5th grade and 6th grade grant. But we also had to follow the issue with 16 and 5th was that we need grants and go up and down and up and down. So we had to follow 3rd grade grant, and that'll have to pass through, but hopefully be eventually even on the grant.
And sometimes that is, that's happened from school to school, Commissioner Campus. That's a
Yeah.
great question.
Well, I'm just looking
Yeah.
at it if we're going to go all 3 or 3-2, and then, so going to that and going to what we've been talking about, I would like to, even though we're limiting this to 16, I would like to say, okay, so where are we going to target the schools? Where are we going to invest to put the big dollars and say, yes, 16 is one of the schools of the future for this district in this neighborhood? Because then if we can be able to have that conversation, I think I need a refresh, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Because so that we can be targeted and it's not just a, okay, with 16, of course we want to keep the school. Of course, it's a great neighborhood. You don't want to have a huge empty building in that neighborhood, but we also have to look at the bigger picture. So
Correct.
For me, I think that that would be helpful overall for us as a board. And I just have to thank Steve so much for everything that you do. Every time you come to a meeting and present, I just feel more confident because in this whole project, because you have 4 kids that went through the district, right?
Yeah.
There's one more. 5.
There's one more. that we-
5, oh my gosh. So
It's a half of a classroom.
So we just,
Thank you, Steve.
I know. So I just want to thank you for all of your work, because you can tell that you're so dedicated.
And I'm going to approve every contract that comes before us if you got your kids in this district.
Yes.
Just one.
I mean, you get my votes.
I know there's more discussion, but because we talked so much about the timeline, I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that it is a joint school construction board project,
Yeah.
so they would really be
Yes.
implementing it. So, you know, all of the discussion about the Costco and how quick things can happen, there are constraints, I guess, and requirements that the board and the implementing team would have.
One more quick question. In the phased approach, does it take into consideration the increase of construction costs at all?
This current report does not.
Okay.
They're all today's dollars.
So it's not,
Okay?
right.
So it gets.
It's going to go up,
Yeah,
right. So it's going to be way more than that.
All the more reason to bring that common sense
Exactly.
discussion to bear.
That's all I-
Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to each one of you.
Everybody have a good New Year.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I want to read this.
Oh, so you want to bring it back?
Yeah, I'll bring it back tomorrow.
So,
Happy New Year to you.
26th
Maybe any resolutions?
council meeting. No, they really wanted to see you. So the 26th, I'm gonna put it out there. Thanks, Shanice, that you
Busy
were
though,
open.
that's.
I know.